Professor Lukin, what do you react? How do you react really to the latest plan of NATO deploying more troops in the Black Sea and also responding strongly to the Russian actions and rhetoric?
I think we should be calm in Russia and don't react in any way, politically, because NATO is an organization which has no reason to exist in the first place. So they are desperately looking for an enemy. And now they found one, and they're very happy about it. Militarily, of course, Russia is reacting, and it's reacting proportionately and takes military measures to answer or to meet the NATO's military buildup.
Okay.
But I think that we should not be too much excited about it.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Lesser from the German Marshall Fund, are you excited about it, the latest plan?
Well, I mean, this is not something to be excited about. It's something to take note of and to also understand the reasons for it. I would disagree with our colleague in Moscow. I think there's a great deal of concern, especially in those NATO allies who are in Russia's region, in the north and in the east of Europe, about what Russia's intentions are. And of course, there are very good reasons for this. I mean, part of it goes back to the occupation of Crimea. Part of it goes back to Russian activity in Ukraine as a whole, back to the Georgian War, if we want to go further back. But I think in a more proximate sense, there's simply a great deal of concern about what Russia is up to with its concentration of military forces, snap exercises, nuclear threats, other things. Now, I can understand that from the Russian side, there are similar historic concerns about NATO intentions. I mean, I think we need to deal with that reality. The problem, of course, is that in the meantime, we don't have a good understanding of each other's intentions. And at the same time, we're doing things that incur all sorts of risks of military accidents.
Mr. Lesser,
I certainly don't think this is something that is being pushed or led by NATO. I think it's something that frankly started on the Russian side.
Okay, Mr. Lesser, may I present to you earlier an argument coming from Professor Lukin, and I really want you to briefly respond to that. That is, to him, it seems that NATO, an organization, does not have a mandate for existence. And apparently they have found one, Russia, to save its life in a way, to save NATO's life. How would you respond to that? About the necessity of the existence of NATO today, after the Cold War?
Mm-hmm. Well, I disagree profoundly. I mean, of course, the organization has every right to exist under the UN Charter, and allies in Europe have every right to come together to organize for their common defense. And it's not just about Russia, frankly. It's also about a lot of other things, from counterterrorism to maritime security in the Mediterranean, cyber threats, all sorts of things that are being taken up by NATO. So, yes, it's true that the conditions are not what they were during the Cold War, thank goodness.
All right.
I don't think we're there. But there's still plenty of concerns about European security and plenty of reasons to have this transatlantic link, and that's what NATO does.
Well, Professor Lukin, what do you make of the arguments from your German counterpart, for example, about the Crimea, about the Syria? They say, well, Russia has made efforts.
Well, American, actually.
All right, therefore. Okay, thank you, sir. What do you make of your colleague's argument, Professor Lukin?
Well, if you're asking me, well, I agree that NATO is very busy of doing things, but whatever it's doing, it brings destruction to this region, you know? All its actions brought destruction to, you know, and its members, to the Middle East, for example, to many countries. So if they want to continue to do it, let them do it, but it has nothing to do with Russia. As for Russia is ready to cooperate with single individual NATO countries on some specific issues.
Okay.
But basically, it understands that it's a mechanism to preserve American domination in the world. And from that point of view, Russia, of course, is not very happy about
Professor,
its existence.
Professor Lukin, if I could go into some of the details of that plan presented by NATO today. First of all, about Norway. Norway is willing to host some of the American troops. Of course, it's on a rotating basis, but still, Russia embassy in Oslo today was announcing the fact that it was kind of surprised by Norway's decision to host the American troops on its own soil in its military base. What do you make of it?
Well, from the very beginning, Russia has stormy relations with NATO. And for a long time during the 1990s and after that, NATO was telling us that it's not a threat and that it's even better for Russia to have NATO near its borders. And now we have, NATO. We have NATO troops right at our borders. Now they're telling us that it's best for everyone if they deploy more and more troops in our neighboring countries. Of course, Russia has to react somehow, and of course, we don't believe a word they say. But we have to deal with them somehow, and at the same time, take some military actions to counterbalance the military presence on our borders.
Okay, let's come back to our American guest. I want to confirm once again, Mr. Lesser, what's your take about the apparently tiny little steps taken by some of the countries, as some would say, if you look at the numbers, 800 more troops by the UK in some of the countries in East Europe, for example, in Estonia. And also, you got some forces, air forces, specific jets being sent to Romania. You've also got some of the other troop deployment, very small in number, in other Eastern European countries. Is this more of a gesture? Is this more of kinds of hard negotiation among countries of NATO members that come up with this apparent solution? Is that really the solution if the threat is as you earlier described?
Well, there's no
Let's have Mr. Lesser. Let's have Mr.
I think
Lesser
the
on
alliance
that.
intends this to be more than symbolic. I mean, it's a matter of.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think the alliance intends this to be more than symbolic. But, if you look at the numbers that we're talking about, and you mentioned some of them, they're really very small compared to the forces that Russia is able to deploy because, of course, they're internal lines of communication, and it's right along the border. So Russia is right there and present. So the balance of power in conventional terms is still, I think, very much in Russia's favor, and this is precisely what concerns countries like Norway, countries like the Baltic states, countries like Poland, who are very much concerned that with Russia's behavior in the last years, the territorial order in Europe is no longer secure. That borders apparently can be changed.
But Mr. Lesser, I have to confirm my question again. I have to put it once again to you. You're not answering the questions, Mr. Lesser. My question to you rather is 800 more troops going to solve any problem? Is this a gesture at all? Is this just an interesting discussion you members have among NATO countries and therefore
it's
come
a
up with
gesture,
something?
But it's a very important. I mean, these are very small numbers, as you say, and I think the point here is not simply to make a political gesture, but frankly to put in place what you might call a tripwire. It's a kind of physical link by their presence there to alliance commitments as a whole, including, of course, that of the United States. And I would also mention the United States would prefer that Europe, frankly, does more on this front. So it's a little bit of it is about that, too, that it isn't all the United States. It's also others, even small allies in Europe who are banding together to help deter this problem.
Okay.
Again, if we had more clarity about what Russia wanted and what Russia was doing, perhaps some of this tension would be dispelled.
Well, we'll see how that will be communicated. And we have many opportunities earlier for that kind of communication. Didn't happen, did it? Ambassador Kurt Volker, that's a former U.S. ambassador to NATO and also now CEO of McCain Institute for International Leadership, joining us from Washington, D.C. right now. Ambassador Volker, welcome to our program. I want to ask you about the specific. We don't want to go with the political slogans or diplomatic answers, but $3.4 billion US dollars. That is the money, US DOD, for European Reassurance Initiative. Is that money, that price tag, really likely to show the friendship that US used to have with the European counterparts? Is that going to make your European counterparts satisfied about the earlier US decision of distancing itself away from the European defense assurance?
I think it's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's enough. The big trend line here, which is important to shape this discussion, is that NATO since 1989 has been cutting its military capabilities year after year after year in terms of defense spending as a share of GDP, US forces in Europe. It's just been nothing but a reduction in defense capability. As Russia has turned around its defense capabilities and done larger exercises and then even used its military in Georgia or Ukraine or Syria now, NATO has finally begun to reverse this trend of decline. And we've seen some countries increase their defense spending. We're seeing these deployments in the East that you mentioned. We're seeing this European Reassurance Initiative where the United States is putting a bit more forces forward deployed. Overall net reduction, but still more forward deployed. It's a step in the right direction. But I think what needs to happen now is actually more European defense capability, as Ian Lesser was saying, and frankly, more U.S. leadership and commitment as well.
Okay. Mr. Lesser, what about the opportunity, the possibility also, for the Europeans to build up their own defense forces, whether it's vis-a-vis Russia, what you consider as an enemy, or somebody else? How much is a possibility there, given the economic challenges and the migrant crisis going on inside Europe right now?
Well, first of all, let me clarify. I don't consider Russia an enemy. I think there's tremendous uncertainty about Russia, what Russia wants, and that's what's driving part of this buildup. But I would say that from an American point of view, certainly from my point of view, the notion that Europe ought to do more is a very old one. And, you know, obviously with the economic stress in Europe at the moment, it's very difficult to get European allies to do more, but some of them are doing more. A lot of them are doing more. I think from an American point of view, from a NATO point of view, it doesn't matter so much whether this is organized as a European initiative or it's organized as a NATO initiative. What really matters is that there's more capability at the end of the day. And if that requires spending more money, that's what's required.
Okay, Professor Lukin, coming from Russia, you've been listening to your two other colleagues. What do you make of this?
I would just maybe say, yeah.
What do you make, Professor Lukin from Russia, of the arguments coming from different sides? Earlier you heard from your colleagues, particularly the relationship between the European continent and also the United States in terms of the defense capability of the Europeans.
Well, I can only say what I said in the very beginning, that all this is ideological cover. If you look at the real situation, you know, Russia only has troops in one country, which is Tajikistan. NATO has troops just about every country in the world, more than 100 countries. You know, Russia has no troops around the United States, for example. And the United States has troops all around Russia. So, of course, we can see from this who is threatening whom. Russia, of course, is rather weak. Russian armed forces are much weaker now. But we have nuclear forces, and we have some power. So we are going to defend ourselves and take appropriate measures.
Okay. Professor Lukin, what does the appropriate measure you mentioned, what does it mean? Several things come to my mind. Correct me if I'm wrong. There are media reports suggesting Russia's defense budget has been tripling. I do not know which number they're looking at, but that's the statement. Secondly, they are saying there have been aircraft carriers of Russia being sent into the Mediterranean Sea. And thirdly, Russia has been using the Syrian port, specifically named Tartus, and has increased their military presence over there. All of these, NATO said earlier, have been regarded as the danger against them and also against the rest of the world, as they say. What do you make of these arguments, Professor Lukin?
What is the argument about? I don't quite understand. Russia is fighting terrorism in Syria, and the United States, for example, is helping terrorists in Syria. It actually armed the terrorists there. Well, they say that they armed not terrorists, but the armaments, the weapons somehow ended up in the hands of terrorists. So, of course, Russia sent some additional troops to fight the terrorists. And we have an agreement with the legitimate government in Syria, which invited our troops. So what's so strange about it? The question is what the United States is doing there, because nobody invited them.
Okay, well, I have to ask Ambassador Volker to answer that question. It's directing at the United States. So Russia is there with the invitation of the Syrian government. What does the U.S. doing there? And why would you consider Russia as the enemy? Russia never considered you as the enemy.
Two separate questions, very important, both of them. Let's start with the enemy image. You're absolutely right that the United States does not consider Russia as an enemy, has not considered Russia as an enemy. From the collapse of the Soviet Union forward, we've tried to work with Russia and partner with Russia in any number of ways, including through NATO, but also bilaterally, including the NATO-Russia Council. And Russia has chosen to maintain an enemy image of NATO, that the fact that independent countries like Lithuania or Poland or Slovenia want to be part of NATO, Russia chooses to view that as an encirclement of Russia, which is as far from the truth as it could be. Similarly, countries like Ukraine or Georgia want to exercise their independence, and Russia has invaded them. So Russia has kept this enemy image of its neighborhood and of NATO, which is a shame because it's not what the United States or NATO wants. When it comes to Syria, the Assad government is responsible for attacking its own population and has killed hundreds of thousands of its own people. Those people have then risen up to rebel against the Assad government. So you have the ongoing civil war inside Syria, largely dominated by a Shia government and a Sunni opposition. Inside of that, you also have ISIS. The United States is interested in fighting ISIS, and we're also interested in working with groups inside Syria who will fight against ISIS with us.
All right.
Some of those groups also oppose the Assad government.
We have heard arguments from both sides. NATO's influence in Eastern Europe has expanded in recent years. If you take a look at this map, you will have better understanding. 3 post-Soviet states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are now members of the military group. Earlier this year, NATO announced plans to station more troops in the Baltic, right on Russia's front door. Meanwhile, Moscow also condemned the move and increased its military presence along its western border in response. The Russian army also regularly conducts war games and training exercises in the region, sometimes with a huge number of troops over there for the joint exercise. Having said that, though, it seems that there has been an opportunity, Professor Lukin, if I could invite your advice here. The NATO side, right after their meeting, they're suggesting, well, maybe ambassadorial level of negotiations and discussions can go on right after this NATO summit. What do you make of that possibility? Is Russia willing to take that step and communicate? Will communication really solve the problem?
Well, I've argued for a long time that we should not have any relations with NATO. Unfortunately, my government believes that we should have some relations, and we actually had stormy relations. You know, they broke. We had some agreements, but they broke also several times. So I don't think any use of talking to such an expansionist organization as NATO. I think we should talk to individual countries instead. But I think that the Russian government will still continue talking to it. You know, we have a representative at the NATO headquarters, and there are some talks going on.